I'm going to build on what was said this morning by Engelbert and Malcolm. In some respects there may be a little bit of repetition. I may go over certain things again, but I'm going to be looking at these ideas and concepts specifically from the point of view of money and finance. So how do we connect to saving and investment, which we've seen are the sort of driving forces and underlying key concepts in Keynesian theory. How do we connect this to monetary and financial theory? How do we differ as post-Keynesians from other monetary theory? Particularly, I'll try and give some distinctions between what I see as the current mainstream view as the new consensus or new Keynesian synthesis. And depending on how I get on for time, I may talk a little bit about some of the internal debates in post-Keynesian theory where it gets a little bit more technical in terms of different views within the school itself rather than us versus other schools. As you saw, I probably had a little quote to start. Money is one of those slightly slippery topics which can lead to confusion, and Karl Marx quoted William Gladstone as noting that not even love has made so many fools of men as contemplating the nature of money. So this is a little cautionary note before we get started. I'm going to start from the same point in some respects as the previous speakers with fundamental uncertainty. And in this context, I'm going to talk about why fundamental uncertainty gives rise to a justification for money existing and why people would want to hold money. We've already had some good introductions of what uncertainty means compared to other theories of things which are unknown, i.e. probability distributions. You know what the probability distribution is, but you don't know what you're going to get from the game. So if you play rolling a dice, you know the rules of rolling a dice, but you don't know which number you're going to get. And really what Keynes is saying in a nutshell is that you don't even know what game you're playing. So there's no point really to worry about the game. You should just get on and decide. But then how do people get on and decide if they don't know what game they're playing? And this is really what uncertainty means. And I have a little quote from Keynes on this. The one that we usually have is the one about the price of copper, so I'll have a different one. Engelbert said that even the weather is predictable, a little bit in Keynes, but at another point he always contradicts himself. He says, is our expectation of rain when we start out for a walk always more likely than not, or less likely than not, or as likely or not? I'm prepared to argue that on some occasions none of these alternatives hold, and if there will be an arbitrary matter to decide for or against, it will be an arbitrary matter to decide for or against the umbrella. If the barometer is high, but the clouds are black, it is not always rational that one should prevail over the other in our minds, or even that we should balance them, though it will be rational to allow caprice to determine us and to waste no time in deciding. So this is what Keynes is talking about. We have no basis on which to make a decision in certain aspects of our decision making, and particularly about deciding about what will happen in the future and how we should decide what we're going to do in the future. And so we fall back on certain conventions, we fall back on instinct, we fall back on animal spirits, which, as the previous presenters have said, are not what Akerlof and Schiller think they are. I'll save that for later, perhaps. And money is a particular institutional form which arises as a way to overcome this uncertainty. And it affects decisions on investment and saving in ways which are quite different to the way that standard theory, as in neoclassical theory based around the interest rate, would argue. So I'm going to try and tease out a bit more what it is about money which can lead to one aspect of this dislocation between saving and investment that we've seen is so important. Okay, I'm going to distinguish a few functions of money and talk about some of the properties of money. Money is unique because of its liquidity. Now, what do we mean by liquidity? If you hold some asset and you want to hold something else, you want to buy something or you want to switch for another asset, you have to exchange. But if you want to exchange, you generally don't exchange the thing that you're holding. You need to switch from what you're holding to something more liquid before you can make the exchange. And the argument about money and liquidity is that the most liquid thing you can get to is money, because you can buy anything for money. And this gives you a range of different types of a range of liquidity attributes on different assets, with something like a nuclear power station being utterly illiquid, to things which are pretty close to money, such as short-term government bonds or other pieces of financial paper, which there are good deep markets for, things you can very quickly turn into money. But none of these things are as liquid as money. So its unique characteristic is it is the most liquid of all assets. And this then brings in a decision for individuals. What do I want to hold? What do I want to own? Do I want to own something which is liquid, or do I want to own something which is less liquid but might do something which money doesn't? It might provide me with some services. And this is what we call liquidity preference. The choice between liquidity, i.e. the ability to spend quickly without having to worry about going off and making some exchange first, and generally having some other form of use, usually in the form of an income, a yield. So you could compare between a government bond, which gives you a rate of interest that might be relatively illiquid, to money, because you can't go to the shop and buy a pint of milk with a government bond. Even though there are liquid markets, you've still got to get on your computer and sell it before you can use it to buy. And I have another quote from Keynes which illustrates this. Money, it is well known, serves two principal purposes. By acting as a money of account, it facilitates exchange through it being necessary that it should ever come in with, By acting as a money of account, it facilitates exchange without its ever being necessary that it should ever come into the picture as a substantive object. In this respect, it's a convenience devoid of significance or real influence. In the second place, it is a store of wealth. So we're told without a smile on the face. But in the world of the classical economy, what an insane use to put it to. For it's recognized that money as a store of wealth is barren, whereas practically every other form of storing wealth yields some interest or profit. Why should anyone outside a lunatic asylum wish to use money as a store of wealth? So this is the question Keynes asks us. Taking the classical assumptions of economics, people are rational, they know which game they're playing, they have a series of assumptions about how they're going to act in the future. Why would they hold something which gives them no return when they could hold something which does give them a return? Why would they choose to lend, which is what you're doing essentially when you're holding money? Why would they choose to lend money to somebody else without getting a payment in return? And the answer is uncertainty. People don't have this perfect foresight or rational expectations. Or the world is not designed such that you always know when you will need to make a payment. You don't know if you're going to break your leg tomorrow and have to go to hospital and pay for the taxi to get there, or these kind of things. So this is a sort of deep reason why money first comes into Keynesian analysis in the general theory. I've already said that this contrasts with the previous prevailing view, which was the classical theory in which investment and saving are determined by the interaction in the savings and loan market, and this interaction is mediated by a price, and that price is the rate of interest, the real rate of interest. So the market sees savers who have some relative preference for consumption now and consumption in the future, confronted with businessmen who have some investment function which determines we think we're going to get some money in the future by investing, but we have to borrow it now. And there's no money in the story, money is a veil. It just sits over the top, and from this you get the quantity theory of money, you get Say's law. You can expand it into the idea that changes in the quantity of money only affect the price level, and you get monetarism and so on, which I may come to depending on how I get on for time. And what Keynes says is, no, you have a choice for savers, which is, okay, they choose how much to save, but once they've chosen how much to save, that isn't the end of the story. They then decide, am I going to save by holding money, or am I going to save by holding some other type of asset? And he, in the initial simple model he uses, he just distinguishes between bonds, which are probably assumed to be issued by firms. So am I going to lend to a firm at a rate of interest, or am I going to hold money which has no rate of interest? And this is the liquidity preference choice in its simplest formulation. Now, I should just clarify one point here. Often when talking about these things, there are certain hidden assumptions which you realize 3 slides in, you've tripped everybody up. For the most part, when I say the rate of interest, I'm going to mean the rate of interest on money. And when I say the rate of interest on money, I don't mean if I went to the bank and put some money in the bank, how much would they give me on my current account, i.e. nothing. But before the crash, they might have given me 1% or something. The assumption I'm going to make for most of this is that money, whatever form it is, has 0 rate of interest. So the rate of interest on money is how much do I have to pay to borrow money? Or if I lend money, how much do I receive? So in some ways, in this simple liquidity preference argument, really what I'm saying, the rate of interest on money is the bond rate of interest, whereas the rate of interest received on money is 0. Does that make sense? Or I might confuse you even further. So Keynes says that there is a saving decision which is made, I might do this with pens. Consumption for Keynes is determined by income. This is what's called the consumption function. People just decide how much of their income they're going to consume. It might be 10%, it might be 5%. So as income changes, the amount people save changes. This already is different to the classical story, because the classical story says saving is determined, well, given income, saving is determined by the rate of interest. So Keynes says no, it's just determined by income and my sort of internal preferences. Then, how shall I do this? What determines how I divide that saving between these 2 assets, liquid assets and illiquid assets? Given that there's a rate of interest to be paid on the illiquid assets and there's no rate of interest on the liquid assets, I weigh up the 2 benefits I see to myself and I make some decision. I don't expect to spend money for 3 weeks, so I'll put that into slightly longer term assets that will give me the money back in 3 weeks on the rate of interest, and the rest I'll keep in my pocket to buy food and whatever else I need for the next few weeks. And this is the result of uncertainty. It's something which, as a result, is unstable because people's views about the future can change suddenly. They might suddenly think they're more uncertain than they were. But what this does is it means that the rate of interest, and this is the rate of interest on money, i.e. the amount of interest you get from lending and borrowing money, is determined by 2 things. It's determined by income, because income determines consumption. What's left is saving, so therefore income affects the rate of interest, but it's also dependent on this liquidity preference relationship, i.e. how much of the saving which I've got left over after I've consumed do I allocate to money, how much do I allocate to bonds. And in the simple bond argument, the yield on bonds is the inverse of the price, so as the demand for bonds increases, the rate of interest will go down, and vice versa. So households, through deciding not to lend money and deciding to hold liquidity for the future because of the uncertainty they feel about the future, can affect the rate of interest. So this is a big jump from what Keynes was arguing against previously, in which the rate of interest is a pure real variable. This is now a monetary variable. Money is non-neutral, because if you change the amount of money in the economy, the implicit assumption here has been that the amount of money is fixed, standing behind this equation. But if we change the amount of money in the economy, then people will be forced to rearrange their portfolios, and that will affect the rate of interest. So this introduces a relationship between the volume of money, and the rate of interest. On the other side, we've already seen, I'm going to call these functions f. They're all different f's. I hope that's all right. Each of these is a function of something. Investment is a function of, in Keynes, it is affected by the rate of interest, the money rate of interest. How much do I have to pay on my bonds as a firm issuing them? But it's also affected by expectations about the future, i.e. Uncertainty. So this is where Keynes makes this break between saving and investment. I wonder if I should quickly just highlight this, because there was questions at the end of the last session about this. Saving and investment, you're saying they're different, but then at the same time you're saying they're the same. What are you talking about? And I know from experience this causes confusion. What we're assuming here is that saving and investment are both flows through time. So if you measure those flows, at the end of time, you have some magnitude. Now, for a closed system, i.e. an economy which doesn't trade, or the world as a whole, there is some volume of output produced. And you can divide that output broadly into two categories, consumption and what is not consumed. So consumption is anything consumed. That's an easy definition. What do we call everything which isn't consumed? Okay, income minus consumption is saving, but also anything which you've not consumed, which you've produced, you must have produced it for a reason. It might be goods that you're not going to consume because you're going to save till later, but we call that inventory accumulation. That's a class of investment. Anything else you've produced is probably machines or something useful, in which case that's also investment. Or you might have produced some goods which you threw away because you didn't want them. You probably call that consumption. It's stupid, but it's consumption. So on this definition, at the end of any given period, saving and investment must be equal. Would you agree? So as a shortcut, what post-Keynesians often do, and we get very used to doing this, is saying, saving is determined by X, Y, Z, investment is determined by X, Y, Z. These decisions are made by different people, therefore they're not the same. What we really mean is that these things are the same. They must be the same by definition, but because different people choose what they want to do, some of them choose how much they want to save, some of them choose how much they want to invest, some mechanism must be there to force these things to become equal. And the neoclassical people have a very simple mechanism, which is just a supply-demand. You just draw supply and demand, which is saving and investment. The rate of interest is a price. It adjusts, no problem. As post-Keynesians, what we normally argue is that output has to adjust. So given a volume of output, you will have, through your liquidity preference relationship, you will have some demand for given output, you will have some amount of saving. This will be divided by two categories of assets. One of these categories of assets is what firms use to finance their investment, which is also determined by their expectations of the future. What happens if these two things are not equal? And I guess this is the sort of almost the most important mechanism here. And as Keynesians, we argue that investment, how should we say this? If intended saving is below investment, then you have a deficiency of effective aggregate demand. So output will fall. So you have two options, essentially. One is to increase investment. You have two options. One is to allow output to fall, so accept a lower level of output. Savers will actually find they're frustrated. They've tried to reduce their consumption to have something left over, but actually what they find is that they've got a smaller share. They've got the same share of a smaller amount left over, so they've been thwarted, they've failed to save, but everyone else also loses out too. The other option is, which I think was causing some confusion, is that you can say that really what we're talking about here is private sector. This is how much does the private sector want to save and how much does the private sector want to invest. And if those two things are not equal, then the government could step in and do the opposite. The government could choose to invest more than it saves, i.e. spend more than it's taxing. To do that, it will have to run a deficit, so it will end up providing the financial assets to the savers in the private sector to allow them to save without output falling by stepping in. So you have deficit financed investment. You could represent this by saying S minus I is the deficiency of aggregate demand, and as long as that is equal to G minus T, which is government demand and also the government deficit, because any difference between these will require government financing. If G is greater than T, it will be a surplus. If G is less than T, it will be a deficit. And then the financial assets will then accrue down here. So if the households want to save more than they want to invest, as long as the government does the opposite, it will run a deficit, and then it will give these people financial liabilities. Slightly long-winded. Does that make some sense? Okay, I've already said that investment is determined by these factors and therefore will not be equal to saving. I guess the key point about this is that you can adjust the rate of interest through adjusting the money supply in this system. So because both liquidity preference, both the decisions of firms and the quantity of money, the decision of savers and the quantity of money in the economic system combine to determine the rate of interest. If you affect one of those variables while holding the other constant, all things equal, you can affect the thing which they're determining, which is the rate of interest. So as long as liquidity preference doesn't change, everything else equal, you increase the money supply, the rate of interest should fall, which should stimulate investment. This sort of underlies the sort of simplistic ISLM types of analysis, because what this misses out is the fact that liquidity preference really is where the uncertainty is represented along with the expectations of firms, and these are the things which are unstable, and these are the things which cause the problems. So once you take these out of the picture and make it just a theory of the money supply and the interest rate, you've actually got a lot less left of Keynes than you should have. What comes next? I think I just said all that, didn't I? Money is not just a means of transaction as in the classical system. It's a way to deal with uncertainty through liquidity preference, a way of holding a liquid asset which gives you no yield. This liquidity preference decision, along with saving, sets the rate of interest. Investment is determined by uncertain expectations and the rate of interest. Therefore, intended saving and investment may not be equal. Therefore, output may be deficient and employment may be below what we would desire. Okay, I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic, endogenous money. So far what I've talked about is how the demand for money affects output through its effect on saving decisions and through its effect on liquidity preference decisions through to the rate of interest. Sort of implicitly what we've assumed is that the money supply is either fixed behind these equations or that it has been varied, but we've varied it by sort of saying, okay, let's just make the money supply bigger or let's make the money supply smaller. So then the question is, what determines the money supply? Where does it come from? Who can set it? And this has been a bone of contention for a long time. The classical view, which Keynes was arguing against, was the quantity theory of money, meaning that essentially the government or the central bank or some mechanism by which those two argued with themselves and decided how much money there was. Given that output was determined in the real sector, saving and investments are intermediated by the rate of interest, which is a pure real variable, then all that changes in the money supply will do is change the rate of inflation. Post-Keynesian view is that up till now I've said that changes in the money supply affect the rate of interest. I'm now going to slightly roll back on that and say from the general theory this caused a lot of debate and argument, but there is now a sort of consensus among post-Keynesians that really what happens is the central bank sets the interest rate and the money supply adjusts to accommodate demand from firms and households. And this matches pretty much what Malcolm and Engelbert were saying. So some of you might have been thinking I was contradicting them up till now. So what's the difference? What am I saying here? In a way, this is partly just an empirical observation from the way that central banks operate and from attempts in the past to control the quantity of money. It's clear that the idea of an exogenous quantity of money is not viable. The way that central bankers think they operate is they set the overnight rate of interest or some short rate of interest. They then adjust reserves, and then through adjustments of reserves, you get the monetary transmission mechanism, and so on. How would this, I've just introduced another distinction, which is the difference between reserves and money. I'll come on to that in just a second. That's my next slide. How would this view fit with the previous liquidity preference argument I made? Liquidity preference doesn't have to just apply to households. It's not just a saving decision. In more recent post-Keynesian thought, I mean, particularly deriving from Minsky, all agents are seen as operating balance sheets in some way. So everybody is forced in a capitalist monetary economy to make decisions on what assets they hold, what liabilities they emit, and so on. And in particular, firms and banks may have liquidity preference. So these, if you combine liquidity preference behavior from all agents in the system with an endogenous demand for money, so given their, let's take their liquidity preference for the time being as exogenous, i.e. we put expectations to one side, given there's a fixed set of preferences in the economy for holdings of assets and liabilities, the central bank can then pick some rate of interest which sits relative to all these different preferences, and then just allow everybody in the economy to say, okay, this is how much I want of money, this is how much I want of the liabilities by other people, this is how much I want to borrow and lend among ourselves, and just let the thing adjust. It doesn't actually mean liquidity preference doesn't matter, unless you take a very extreme view, but it casts it in a slightly different light. Now, I said the central bank sets the rate of interest on reserves. So this brings us on to another distinction, which is the distinction between inside and outside money. I would define these by saying that inside money refers to what we regard as financial assets and liabilities generated inside the economy we are looking at, which for this discussion will be the private economy. So we'll say the government, central bank, the monetary authority sits outside the economy. Inside the economy, money is generated endogenously. So how can the economy generate money inside itself? Commercial banks create money when they issue loans. And this is something which happens inside the private economy. So a firm goes to a commercial bank, it says, can you lend me £1,000? The commercial bank puts £1,000 on its liability side. Which side's that? Its liability side, over here for English, over here for American. It puts £1,000 on its asset side as a loan, and then the opposite transaction is made for the firm, and this happens inside the economy. How does this relate to the money that comes from outside the economy? Outside money is what we call fiat money, or government-created state money. Money which is not backed by anything tangible these days. There's no longer gold backing fiat money. So the distinction between inside and outside money could be one between credit money, i.e. money created when credit is extended by private institutions, and outside money, which is created by the government. And then there's a debate between how these monies interact. Now for the monetarists, it was very straightforward. Commercial banks have to operate with a reserve requirement, which means that the amount of inside money they create is a fixed multiple of the amount of outside money they hold, i.e. reserves and cash in the vault. And then the central bank, or the monetary authority, can determine how much outside money is available. So then you get a nice straightforward mechanism where you just adjust central bank reserves and cash, and then the inside money of the system adjusts to match. Unfortunately, it's not true. So what we argue as post-Keynesians, and it's very strongly fits with the empirical evidence, is that essentially the demand for money is the key thing. So firms decide how much they want to invest. That determines some demand for money. They go to the bank, they try and borrow that money. The bank generally says, are you going to do what you say you're going to do? Do I trust you, etc., etc. If the bank trusts the person to pay back the money with a certain degree of confidence based on uncertainty that the banks face, then they will make the loan. And this may lead the commercial banks to be short of reserves if, for example, these banks try and convert the deposits they have into banknotes, then commercial banks will be short of reserves, so they will go to the central bank, and the central bank will give them reserves, which they will lend to them. So the mechanism is completely reversed. So we say that lending creates deposits, and this lending creates deposits relationship in turn causes reserves to be created by the central bank. So it's a complete reversal of the sort of standard money multiplier which you find in the textbooks and which was the standard story for monetarism. What do we want to say about so what determines the rate of interest on inside money, i.e. the rate of interest charged by commercial banks to customers? This leads to a debate with inside post-Keynesian economics called one side the horizontalists and one side the structuralists. I think I will leave most of this for later, but essentially banks are seen as businesses, so they charge a markup. If banks have, let's say, two things on their balance sheet, loans and deposits, they will try to make a margin between those things. So you could say, for example, that they pay zero interest on deposits and they charge a positive rate of interest on loans. So this is how they make their spread. And this spread may be determined as a markup based on the rate of interest charged to them from the central bank. So it's a markup pricing type of theory of how banks set their interest rates. So essentially what we say is that the central banks set some rate of interest for reserves. This determines and then supplies reserves to commercial banks as and when they want to use that facility. But the rate of interest will then be a sort of benchmark, and then commercial banks will use that benchmark as a benchmark to set their own rates as markups over that rate, depending on various behavioral assumptions such as their liquidity preference, their understanding of the safety of borrowers, and so on. So this, as Malcolm emphasized in his talk this morning, gives us the assumption which loans create deposits. So it reverses another of the standard causal theories, and it connects to the previous reversal which we've emphasized, which is that investment is the dominant out of saving and investment is the causal first link. So investment causes saving to happen, and this is a result of the fact that in some ways that the banking system operates in the way it does, because saving will never constrain investment, but access to finance may constrain investment. So as long as we understand the banking system as able to create credit at will, then as long as the banking system does perform this role, there will be no impediment to investment and therefore to output, employment, and growth, and so on. So the causal mechanism is that the banks create loans. At the same time, deposits are created. For the moment, I'm still assuming that the firms are the borrowers. The firms will then use these deposits to spend by purchasing capital goods, investment. This will increase output. And then what happens to these deposits that were created? We know that the firms owe the bank money. We know they've spent their deposits. Where have they gone? Okay, well, they will pay wages to workers. They will also pay other firms to buy capital goods, which will, some of those payments will also go to wages. Some of those will be stored as profits. So at the end of the period, we can then look what's the configuration. And by and large, we will generally find that households have got some of those deposits left as savings. Some of the deposits may have come back to firms as retained earnings, in which case they can choose to pay down some of their debt. And this is a sort of circuit approach to money. Okay, I'm going to change the topic again and move on to the idea of financial instability, which is another, in some ways, it's a sort of parallel stream within post-Keynesian economics. And it's associated most prominently with the work of Hyman Minsky, which has become talked about, if not possibly read, since the financial crisis. And what Minsky argues is that the general theory was received wrongly. I mean, it was received wrongly partly because Keynes, as Engelbert said, made a bit of a mess of getting his argument across in an attempt to retain a dialogue with the people he was arguing against. And what Minsky says is that the general theory ended up in its sort of ISLM form as a theory of different short-run equilibria. And I've got equilibria in inverted commas there because these equilibria could be equilibria in which there is involuntary unemployment, and in fact usually will be, but points at which the economy can't get out of. The economy is not going to move to a different point, i.e. return to full employment without some external change. And Minsky says, no, this is an incorrect interpretation of Keynes. What Keynes was really trying to do was come up with a theory of business cycles. So not why the economy moves to some point, which we don't want it to be at and then just sits there, but why the economy moves through time, through a sequence of different points, some of which may be quite nice, some of them which be unpleasant. So how you get boom and bust cycles. So he tries to make what was perceived as a static theory into a dynamic theory. And he says that the thing that Keynes didn't spend enough time talking about in the general theory is finance. How does the finance available to firms change through time? Because, as we've said, saving can't restrain output, as in the classical model. Investment is what determines output, and saving adjusts, because if you increase investment, then output increases. People found they've saved more than they intended to save, so saving is the passive variable. So then what determines investment? Why is investment unstable? And as Engelbert said, it's very clear empirically that if you look, that is the unstable variable, and it correlates with output. So up until that point, we seem to be getting somewhere. But if there is no constraint to investment, then why would it be unstable other than uncertainty and animal spirits, which is a big part of the story? But Minsky says that one of the key ways that uncertainty and animal spirits enter this is through finance and through the decisions of firms on how they finance themselves and the decisions of banks and other financial market operators on whether they will finance firms. Will I choose to lend you money, or will I choose to keep the money? So again, this liquidity preference relationship. And Minsky argues that in capitalism, in monetary capitalism, you cannot avoid being a speculator. You're constantly placing bets, essentially. You don't know what the future will bring. Any decision you make on whether to buy a house, whether to put your savings in a mortgage bank, whether to buy shares on the stock market, is a speculative one. You don't know the outcome, so you're playing a game. So Minsky says speculation cannot be avoided. To decide is to place a bet. So every time you make a decision in a monetary capitalist economy, you're placing a bet, which you may or may not win. And let me see if I can draw around the picture. Is there a... Let me turn this round. There we go. So Minsky is saying, how does a firm decide how much to invest, and how does it decide how it will finance that investment? And for the time being, I'm going to say that pretty much implicitly we're assuming that when firms borrow, what they're doing is borrowing from households. Now they may be borrowing from households directly, it's not borrowing, but they may be getting money directly from households through equity, i.e. households own the firms, and use some part of their savings to allow the firms to spend in return for a share of the profits, or they may lend through bank finance. And bank finance or credit finance of any sort, debt finance, has a known cost, i.e. the rate of interest on money. So Minsky says, all right, what's the firm's decision? The firm says, I'm contemplating some investment, I want to buy some capital assets. Why would I buy the capital asset? Because it will give me a return. I'll get a sequence of money incomes, cash flows through time in the future. And the firm takes those cash flows and it capitalizes them. Are people happy with the idea of capitalization of yields, i.e. you take some rate of interest and that tells you how much less valuable something in the future is than now, because you could have taken the money and just put it in the bank and got 5% rate of interest. So if you're going to get some income in a year's time, you need to say, well, actually that income has got to be at least as much as I could have got by putting it in the bank. So I can knock some value off that future income. So if you give me £100 next year, and I know the rate of interest is, if you offer to give me £100 next year and I know the rate of interest is 5%, then I'm going to say to you, okay, I'm not going to give you £100 now if you're going to give me £100 next year. I'm going to give you less. That's worth less to me. So you have to discount future income. So what Minsky says is that by discounting future income off into the future, you come up with some capitalized present value. And this will determine this will be one of the things which enters into the firm's decision. Against that value of what I think I'm going to get, I have to work out what I'm going to pay. And the firm has to, in order to do this, it has to work out how much it has of internal funds and how much it needs to borrow. The amount it needs to borrow will have to pay interest on, and then it does the same calculation essentially. It capitalizes the cost of interest. And what Minsky says is that in a perfect world, essentially, as long as the yield is not affected by diminishing returns and so on, then it doesn't matter how much, so this is quantity of investment, doesn't matter how much I invest, the yield per unit wouldn't change. This is in a perfectly competitive world. This is a sort of counterfactual. In a perfectly competitive world, without diminishing returns to scale, it doesn't matter. If I'm a firm, I can just keep on investing, and every additional unit of capital I buy will give me, I don't know, 7% a year. So this is the yield or return. What shall I call it? Yield. He then says, okay, there's a supply price of capital, and in a competitive market, if I'm a small firm, then I shouldn't be able to affect that market. So the supply price of capital will be also horizontal. So this is the price of supply. This is the yield expected. And then he says there would be some interest payment. And again, if banking markets were competitive and so on. So then you add the cost of interest. So this is your, what did I say this was? This is yield. This is the price. So this is price plus interest payments capitalized. What shall I call this? Capitalized interest rate. In that situation, what places a limit on firms' investment? Nothing. He says that really Keynes made a mistake because he assumed that there was a downward slope yield because he had this sort of, he got stuck in the idea of a diminishing marginal productivity of capital from classical economics. But Minsky says, no, actually, this doesn't make sense because up until some point, the firm will actually have some internal profit. So this is saving from the previous period which the firm's got in the bank. So up till there's no rate of interest. So that's wrong. Once you go beyond your internal liquidity, yes, you pay interest. But the more you pay interest, the more you invest beyond what you can fund yourself, the more the bank's going to look at you and say, oh, this doesn't look too clever. All right, you've got £100 in cash. You want to borrow £1, fine. You want to go and buy some milk in the shop. But if you come to the firm with £100 in cash and you say, I want to borrow £1 million to build a new school, they're going to say, well, this is not too good. So what Minsky argues is actually that this curve should be this shape. Likewise, he says uncertainty, fundamental uncertainty, keeps coming back, says that the businessman looks at the yields and he says, all right, I think I'm going to get 7% a year, but the more he's investing, the more he looks at those yields and says, well, actually, I'm not so certain now. The more I invest, the more I'm worried that I might not get the 7% I'm hoping for, and the more it's going to cause me trouble if I'm past my internal funding. So really, this should be this shape. And this then allows you to say, okay, there's an intersection. It's a sort of supply and demand relationship which is determined as a result of fundamental uncertainty on both the part of the businessman, what do I think I'm going to get in the future, and the person lending to the businessman, how much do I trust this person, how much do I think they're going to do what they say they're going to do, and that is what fixes the volume of investment. Now, the problem with this is both of these are based on subjective views about the future, which are subject to uncertainty. And what Minsky says is that, okay, a firm and a bank will have a relationship, this will happen once, and it will be fine. The firm will borrow the money, the bank will get paid back, the firm's investment will be successful, everybody's happy, and they'll both look at each other and say, well, actually, you know what, I underestimated you, so next time I'll do it this way. And the businessman will say, so that was this curve actually, and the businessman will say, yeah, you're right, you know what, I was a bit too cautious, I should have known this was going to work out. So next time, I should have said that this is the yield, but it's also the rate of interest charged. This affects the capitalized rate of interest. So the price isn't changing because it's a competitive market, but the rate of interest charged by the banks increases with the scale of investment. But the more that this is successful, the more banks and businessmen are willing to say, we're being too cautious. So the banks will be willing to extend credit over and above internal funds to firms at ever greater levels, and this is financial fragility. This is what we call the debt. So this is debt financed, this is equity financed. The more this point moves this way, the more the proportion of debt to equity increases. So this is an increasing debt to equity ratio, i.e. increasing financial fragility. And what Minsky says is that over the course of the cycle, the more that you have successful investment, the more that this debt to equity ratio will increase, and eventually people will start to make mistakes. They get sloppy, and then at some point businesses will start to fail, and they will realize they have not taken into account enough potential risk. Banks will start to see their balance sheets looking rather ugly as loans turn bad, and you get the opposite effect. Suddenly you get people's subjective views about the future, determined under fundamental uncertainty, changing based on what has just happened to them. And this, for Minsky, determines an investment cycle and therefore an output cycle. And you can add to this how people operate in financial markets, such as equity markets and so on, to get a cyclical boom and bust dynamic. What else do I want to say about this? Okay, and yeah, one of the best known aspects of Minsky's theory is this rather neat classification he gives of different types of financing arrangements. So this is a sort of graphical representation of a firm's balance sheet, and Minsky says you can divide firms' balance sheets into three different types. The best kind is a hedged balance sheet. What this means is that the firm not only has enough from its yield up here to pay the rate of interest on its investment, it can also each period pay back some of its loans. So over time, the debt to equity ratio is actually falling because the firms are paying back principal all the time. This is a hedged position. Next is if we move to a position where the yield on capital assets is just enough to cover the interest payments, but you're not paying back principal, you're then a speculative firm. So your debt to equity ratio, all else equal, will be staying the same. It's not so bad, but you're aging towards problems. This is like a sort of, you could think of an interest-only payment on housing. You buy a house and you get a mortgage and you can only just about afford to cover the interest out of your wages. You're in a much more tenuous position than if you can pay the interest and also knock a little bit of principal off every year. And then the third type of financial structure or balance sheet structure is the Ponzi finance structure. Now in this, what is happening is the firm is not even able to cover interest payments out of current income. So this sees firms very much, or agents very much as a set of balance sheets. Everybody is a balance sheet in this view, with some money coming in and some money going out. And the thing that really matters is, is more coming in than going out, or vice versa. And the problem with this one is there's more going out than coming in. You simply cannot cover your debts. So what do you do? If you are in debt and you can't pay your interest payments, Minsky says that generally, at least for a while, what people will do is they'll borrow more. So I can't cover my interest on my mortgage, I'll stick it on my credit card. Oh no, now I've got a credit card bill which I can't pay. What do? I go to the payday loans guy and I get a loan from him and I use that to pay off my credit cards, but then you've got a guy with a big stick outside your door who wants $3,000 like tomorrow. That's Ponzi finance. And what Minsky argues is you can have, at any one time, an economy will be made up of units which with a selection of these different types. And obviously what you want is more hedge and less Ponzi. But over the course of the boom, this sort of increasing willingness to extend finance means that more and more firms move up through the different classifications. And there's a sort of knock-on effect which can start. Obviously, the Ponzi finance will eventually blow. So that's the first place where things go wrong. But then once the Ponzi finance people go and realize they can't pay their debt and default, they may have been borrowers from somebody who was speculative, i.e. the income to a speculative unit may have actually been coming from a Ponzi unit, in which case the speculative unit then goes down. So you get this kind of cascading effect, and people who were previously speculative units are suddenly Ponzi units, and people who were previously hedged are speculative, and then you get the downturn, the debt deflation dynamics, and it starts again. So you get a natural progression through different stages leading to inevitable recurring crises. So in some respects, I've been thinking about this recently, in some respects this is almost a pure psychological theory of the cycle. I mean, it's not irrational psychology in the sense that some of the sort of Shiller-Akerlof people say it is, because we've already said under fundamental uncertainty you have no real rational basis on which to make decisions. But it is people's changing expectations which are causing the cycle. And I found this interesting because I read Schumpeter and Minsky back to back, and Schumpeter moves from a sort of bank-based theory of the cycle to a theory of the cycle which is very much sort of mechanistic and based on innovation and long cycles. And Minsky criticizes him and says his later version of the cycle is mundane, it's boring, he's left out finance, he's sort of missed the point. But if you go back to Schumpeter, you actually see that he says the one thing you can't do is have a purely psychological theory of the cycle. If you do that, it's not economics. So there's this sort of tension between these two writers. So it's a sort of subjective theory of how people's subjective perceptions change, leading to different decisions. Okay, another change of topic. How are we doing for time? I've got about 20 minutes left. How does this affect our view of how money and the state interact? It changes the view of what the central bank should do quite considerably, because it may be that in a sudden increase of liquidity preference, i.e. if banks decide that they were previously over here and they actually want to be over here, you will get a contraction of credit, and it may not, in the central bank, maybe a slightly cooler-headed set of individuals, and it may say, it's not so bad, your debts aren't bad, what we should do is step in and we'll refinance. So the central bank should be much more active, particularly acting as a lender of last resort. And this goes back to Bagehot's, I can't remember exactly when, but it's a long time ago, argument that what the central bank should do is lend against good collateral, essentially without limit, to support solvent banks. So this is one implication. Also, going back to the sort of the pre-Minsky, the before Minsky in what I was talking about, you can argue that if we have this idea, that's on the other side of the board, no, it was before I wiped it off, of, for example, the government stepping in to make up the difference between saving and investment intentions in the private sector. So if you don't want output to contract to allow these things to match, if the government is going to step in, then the government needs to be financed. And if not only the private sector has decided it wants to save more than it wants to invest, but it doesn't want to finance the government as well, it wants to hold money, not government bonds, so there's a sort of liquidity preference problem, then the central bank should play the role of financing the government. It should purchase government bonds, give the government liquidity to allow it to run deficits in order to maintain full employment. But there are also, I would argue, limits to monetary policy on its own in post-Keynesian theory. So the example I just gave you was financing government deficits. That implies actually that the government had to step in and run a fiscal deficit. So what we would say is that you try quantitative easing without fiscal expansion, you're going to get what you've got. You're going to give all the commercial banks a whole bunch of outside money. They're going to take it and say thanks and hold it. Are you going to have an increase in inside money, i.e. commercial banks going to firms saying, hey, we've got a whole bunch of money, do you want it? Doesn't look like it. Firms going to the bank saying, we want money. This is a slightly sticky point because it's very clear that small and medium firms would quite like some credit and they're not getting it. I might come back to that point. But the sort of key point is that monetary policy on its own may or may not be effective. It's probably more effective at restraining than stimulating. This is Keynes's example of pushing on a string. You've got something on a string, you can pull it to stop it, but if you try and push it back again, it's not going to work. So this is monetary policy without supportive policy from the government. And I probably don't need to expand. Engelbert said quite a lot about inflation. This is not inflationary. Printing money doesn't cause inflation directly. I mean, it may cause effects on price markups, wage relations, and so on, but we reject the simple quantity theory which says you print money, you get inflation. Again, the evidence is not there. The recent period is a good example. They've printed a lot of money in inflation. I mean, they say inflation is high because it's 3.2%, not 2.8% or something, but it's not high. It's remained remarkably low. So this brings me on to, let's bring out a little bit more clearly some of these distinctions with what I'm going to call mainstream views. Up till now, I've sort of characterized the mainstream view rather unfairly as this money multiplier view. So monetarist doctrine in which the volume of inside money is controlled directly through the credit multiplier by the volume of outside money. This is not really a fair characterization of what sort of standard textbook monetary theory now is. But what I'm going to argue is that the way that the thing is sold is now different, but actually the policy conclusions are almost the same, in as much as money has an effect in the short term but not the long term. So the current theory will tell you that yes, you can stimulate the economy. It's not by changing the volume of money directly, it's through adjusting the interest rate, but this will lead to inflation in the long run if you don't either reverse your stance or let me come back to this. So, what have I put here? Money supply determines prices. Yeah, so this is how I characterized monetarism, in that the thing we're worried about is price inflation. The thing which causes price inflation is the volume of inside money in the system, the amount of commercial bank money, and the central bank should use the control of outside money to try and fix targets for the growth of inside money in such a way that inflation is kept within the boundaries of what monetarists think are good bounds for inflation, i.e. 2 or 3%, this kind of thing. This was tried sort of in the late 70s, early 80s. There was the Volcker shock, as they call it, and the Thatcher experiment in the UK, and by and large it was found to be fairly unsuccessful. It bred something called Goodhart's law. Charles Goodhart was a central banker at the time, and what he says is that as soon as the government attempts to regulate any particular set of financial assets, these become unreliable as indicators of economic trends. So what the government would do is they'll say there's a whole bunch of different ways of measuring money. You've got reserves and cash, and then you've got commercial bank deposits, and then you've got time deposits. There's a sort of spectrum rather than a clear demarcation. And the government would pick one of these numbered aggregates, M1, M2, M3, M4 or whatever, and would say, okay, that's the one we're going to stabilize. That's the one which leads directly to price inflation. We'll stabilize that by adjusting reserves. And then as soon as they did that, that indicator would appear to lose all of its correlation with reserves. So then they pick another indicator and try that, and then that one would become unstable. And eventually they ran out of indicators and they started coming up with new ones because none of them were stable enough. So there was a sort of proliferation of different monetary indicators. In the end, they accepted it wasn't working. And there are central bankers who will say, really, we knew what we were doing at the time was setting the rate of interest anyway. I mean, the rates of interest went very, very high when they tried to do this. And there are central bankers who said, really, we knew we were just setting interest rates high, but we said it was monetary-based targeting. So then the theory has moved on, and we have what's called new consensus macro. I'm going to characterize this as a Wickselian system. What does that mean? This comes back to the classical idea that the rate of interest is a real variable determined by how much people want to consume now versus how much in the future, and how much investment demand there is. And that is something which is kind of invariant. You can't do anything about it. Then what should you do in order to maintain price stability? Well, this goes back to Wicksell, who over 100 years ago had this idea that as long as the money rate of interest is set exactly at this natural rate of interest, then you don't have inflation. You don't have a problem. As soon as you put the rate of interest on money loans below the natural rate of interest, then firms think, okay, if I invest, my real return will be 7%, but it's only costing me 3% to borrow. That leads to a sort of disequilibrium of this type where firms have, there's a straight line here and a straight line here. Firms just endlessly borrow more. They then find that because we're not in a sort of Keynesian world where supply can adjust, output is fixed at some full equilibrium, all you get is inflation. So that was Wicksell's argument over 100 years ago. And really, what new consensus macro does is sort of take that argument and update it mathematically and technically. And one thing they do is they make money a pure unit of account. So what do I mean by that? I've sort of fudged this a little bit. I started out with Keynes and liquidity preference, and it was very clear then that money was a store of value. Keynes is talking about why would anyone outside a lunatic asylum hold money as a store of value. And as you move to these sort of credit theories of money, the emphasis shifts to the unit of account, so i.e. the thing in which prices are denominated in. And this was something that Wicksell emphasized and is emphasized probably in the more recent post-Keynesian monetary theory, and also the mainstream has now sort of come round to this idea. So I have a quote actually from Ghali and Gertler, who are two leading proponents of the new consensus macro, and they say, it's important to distinguish between money and monetary policy. Monetary policy affects real activity in the short run purely through its effect on market interest rates. Thus, while monetary policy is central in these models, money per se plays no role other than to provide a unit of account. So not only do quantities of money not exist in these models, they actually, not count for anything in these models, they don't even exist. So these are models of monetary policy in which there is actually no money. There is simply rates of interest. And there are two rates of interest, a rate of interest on money, which is something which doesn't exist, and a rate of interest on in the real economy, which is determined by saving and investment. So you set the rate of interest on this thing which doesn't exist. Above or below the real rate of interest, you get inflation. And what they argue then essentially is that what you should do is, okay, one step back. You don't immediately get inflation because in a new Keynesian world, you can say that what Keynes was really about was the fact that prices are sometimes a little bit sticky to adjust. So what you can do is you can add onto these models a slow price adjustment. So there's the real rate of interest. The central bank sets the nominal rate of interest on the imaginary thing which doesn't exist below the real rate of interest. And what you should get is inflation, but because there's some slow price adjustment mechanism, in the short term you get an increase in output, and then you get a slow gradual adjustment as prices start to rise, and then eventually you just move to a new equilibrium of higher inflation. So this is actually exactly what the monetarists said but they said you increase the money supply, you get a short increase in output, then you get inflation. Now the new Keynesians are saying is you adjust the rate of interest, you get a short burst of output, then you get inflation. So really what you should do is set rates of interest on imaginary things called money using a Taylor rule, which is a sort of automatic feedback mechanism. So as soon as the rate of inflation goes above your target based on what you think the real rate of interest is, then you adjust the money rate of interest, and this should lead to an automatic stabilization. So I guess the points I'm making here is that in a way this has come around to the sort of post-Keynesian view that money is an endogenous variable which adjusts based on demand, and what the central bank should do is set interest rates. But it's a very sort of it's a very weak understanding of this, because it still sees the system as tending towards equilibrium, and all you're doing by adjusting interest rates is sort of steering the ship around that equilibrium, rather than seeing money as something which fundamentally affects real variables in the long term. What shall we talk about next? I have 10 minutes? 5 minutes? 5, okay. I'm going to skip a few slides in that case. Very briefly, I'll just mention horizontalism versus structuralism. This is an argument within post-Keynesian theory, and it essentially centers around a debate between people who say that what I said here was this was demand from firms given how much they want to invest, and this is bank credit. The horizontalist argument sort of said that actually banks don't do this, because central banks will always supply reserves on demand at a known rate of interest, which is their target rate of interest. Banks will always just mark up that rate of interest and supply loans on demand to creditworthy customers. Therefore, the rate of interest in relation, the volume of money in the system, which is essentially given by this demand for money from investment, has no upward sloping relationship with the rate of interest. And then this was attacked by what came to be called structuralists, who sort of defended the Minsky position and said, no, there are various reasons why, for example, banks will be unwilling to lend beyond certain limits, and that will lead to an upward sloping supply curve for money. But I'm not going to say a great deal more about that. What about Kalecki? Up till now, we've distinguished sectors in the economy largely as private sector and the government sector, and we've said that if there is a difference between the desire to save and the desire to invest in the private sector, then one way to get around this is if the government steps in and does the opposite and deficit finance expenditure to keep output at the full employment level. Another way to split the economy up is by taking the private sector. Let's put the government to a side for the moment, so we'll assume the government is running a balanced budget, it's hitting the Maastricht criteria and more. So we're talking about the private sector alone, but then we say we can split the private sector into two types of agents, firms and households, and we can make certain behavioral assumptions about what those agents will do based on their type. Now we've said, so up till now I've been talking, when I say saving and investment, I've been talking about intended, i.e. things that can be different. These three equations I've got are now outcomes. They're what we call ex post. So these are the accounting balances which must be equal when you measure them at the end of the period. So for a closed economy, total saving must be equal to total investment. But you can divide the saving into two classifications, of which one is household saving and the other is saving of firms, i.e. retained profits. And by rearranging, you can say that so saving is equal to saving of households plus saving of firms. Saving is equal to investment, therefore total investment is equal to the saving of households plus the saving of firms. If you rearrange this by adding some behavioral assumption, which is that the thing which drives the system is investment, so the decision that the firm makes is the investment decision, you then find that Profits, i.e. the savings of firms, are determined by the amount of investment minus household savings. So given an amount of investment by firms, household saving then becomes a deduction from profits. And if you take this to the extreme by assuming that households do not save, so you say that households are on the breadline, they consume all of their income, so household saving is zero, all wages are consumed, you can take the SH away from here and you get the result that profits are determined by investment. So this is another one of these initially paradoxical seeming reversals of causality. You think that the amount of investment will be, I need to be careful what I say here, because investment is affected by the rate of profit, but the volume of profits, i.e. What I've called SF here, as long as households don't save, by accounting identity must be equal to investment. So as long as firms are able to get access to finance, they can increase their own profits simply by investing more. And this is captured in Kalecki's famous quotes where he says, capitalists get what they spend and workers spend what they get. And from the monetary side, Kalecki argues that if additional investment is financed by bank credit, the spending of the amounts in question will cause equal amounts of saved profits to accumulate as bank deposits in the accounts of firms. So this is a sort of monetary counterpart to some of what Malcolm was saying this morning about the dividing saving propensities into saving out of consumption and saving out of profits. Then you have these potential disequilibria, and this is the sort of monetary side of that circuit. Shall I say something about modern monetary theory? I'm running out of time, aren't I? What else have I got? There was a question this morning about modern monetary theory. This has become quite prominent, partly because it's propagated largely through blogs and online through these kinds of mechanisms rather than through journals. So it's very visible to the public if you search for stuff about money and saving and investment. You get a lot of modern monetary theory coming up, and it's associated particularly with University of Missouri, Kansas in America and the Levy Institute, and it has a number of propositions which in some ways are very compatible with post-Keynesian theory, but at the same time there are certain divergences of opinion between most post-Keynesians and sort of more committed modern monetary theory people. What do they say? One of their first sort of founding principles is that what determines what we use as money? This is the question they set. What determines what we use to buy and sell things? And I think this is actually quite an interesting part of their analysis. They say that state power is very important in this. Because the state can force its citizens to pay taxes, and it can choose what it wants taxes to be paid in, i.e. its own liabilities, it can determine the money of account. So that means that everybody has to hold the money produced by the government in order to pay their taxes. This gives government a power which no other agent has because it can emit liabilities essentially without limit, because money is a liability of the government. And almost from this one sort of assumption, they derive a whole sequence of other results, largely through these kind of accounting exercises I've shown you, fairly simple accounting exercises. By adding up balances over different sectors and different actors in the economy, you can find that certain things must add up ex post, so at the end of the day. And they say that the causation of a lot of these things is actually the inverse of the sort of intuitive understanding. So taxes cause people to hold money. The next thing they say is that governments don't issue bonds in order to deficit finance. What governments do is they print money because everybody has to use the money they print because they use it for taxes. Everybody has to accept the money. So bond issuance is not what it looks like. But you don't issue bonds in order to finance your deficit. Why do you issue bonds? because you want to affect the rate of interest. If you flood the money markets with new government money, i.e. outside money, banknotes and bank reserves, what you will find is that the overnight market, the overnight rate of interest will fall to zero, and you might not want this. So bonds, government bonds are a liquidity management tool. You don't need to issue bonds to government deficit, to finance government deficits, but you might want to issue bonds just to mop up some of the additional liquidity. And as a result of these sort of conclusions that government deficits, as a result of this, don't matter because governments can always finance their deficits. There's never a finance constraint to governments unless they don't determine the unit of account, as in Greece, for example. So they have an argument which is, we saw Greece coming because we said that Greece can't issue its own money, therefore it can't determine the unit of account, therefore it can't finance its deficits. As long as Greece can print its own money, there's never going to be a financial constraint on government spending. So this leads to a collection of policy conclusions which are called functional finance, which are very appealing in many ways because it seems that you can solve many of society's problems almost through sort of accounting magic. The government can simply employ everybody. They have an argument for employer of last resort, as Malcolm mentioned this morning. So what I would say about modern monetary theory is that essentially they take a lot of what is very close to post-Keynesian theory, but I think they take it to a sort of extreme. They push it beyond the realms of what is feasible, at least. And it's also, I think, rather US-centric. It may well work for a country which operates the global reserve currency, but it probably wouldn't work so well for small open economies which are connected to larger trading blocks and so on. But I think I'll leave that if there are any questions. I think I should wind up. I can see people are getting tired. I've already said a bit about policy conclusions from post-Keynesian theory. They're really quite stark in comparison to mainstream theory. Shouldn't worry too much about government deficits as long as they can be financed. Inflation targeting is a mistake. Monetary policy has its limits, but is useful, and is useful in particular as a way of supporting government deficit financing. So I think I will wrap it up there and see if there are any questions.